Now, a grade 10 pupil yesterday gave birth in the toilets of Molautsi Secondary School in Bloodriver outside Polokwane. The school has in the past been reported to have a high number of teenage pregnancies. The 16-year-old girl is said to have had a premature delivery at 7 months. Let's now shine the spotlight on teenage pregnancies. We are now joined via video link by Equal Education candidate attorney Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, this story is quite traumatic. One would imagine, what that teenager was going through. I mean, just talk to us about how prevalent teenage pregnancies are in the country, and of course, what could be the attributing factors to this high number.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me firstly. And absolutely, and I suppose maybe just to say to the viewers that I think a large part of this discussion is unfortunately by its very nature distressing. We actually don't even know the full extent of teenage pregnancies or early pregnancies in South Africa because of chronic underreporting. But we do know that we have certainly one of the highest rates in the world for comparable economies. Our rate has continued to increase in many senses, and particularly increased since 2020 because of the COVID lockdown. There are many factors, which I'm sure we'll get into some of them, that are a cause for this. But you could probably sort of boil some of them down to perhaps three key sort of categories of factors. The one is criminal. The second is maybe you might call it social or structural. And the third might be environmental, economic. And overwhelmingly, of course, it's very important to bear in mind that particularly since we've had recorded cases in the past 5 years of girls as young as 8 or 9 being pregnant, that we exist in a country that has exceedingly high rates of sexual and gender-based violence. And so I think that would be the most important factor to draw our attention to. The majority of children who experience sexual violence experience it perpetrated by someone that they know. And so that may be someone in their home. It may also be a teacher. But we also know that, in addition to that, child early and forced marriage is often a cause of early pregnancy and sometimes a consequence, especially in provinces like Limpopo, Mpumalanga, KZN, Eastern Cape. And also the fact that societally, the way we treat girls and boys regarding their sexuality is very different. We give boys a general level of permissiveness compared to how we treat girls, whereas we'll often expect girls to behave in the dark, under taboo, and we'll very often blame them for the consequences of either things that they do or things that are done to them. And it's for that exact reason that you'll often see a heaping of blame on teenage girls in schools, but you'll very rarely see teenage boys excluded or expelled from schools.
Yeah, and I mean, when you say that we don't know the full extent, I mean, one just goes back to the statistics that are available at hand. I mean, according to the Department of Education, they speak of over 150,000 young girls who were pregnant in 2022-2023 financial year. I mean, that is a staggering number. And I mean, you also mentioned some of these children are as young as 9 and 10. So in the event, of course, that a child is pregnant in a school environment, I mean, what are the key important things that the school or the Department of Education should immediately enforce when they uncover that? Because, I mean, we can't, shy away from the fact, as you also pointed out, that there could be very likely a criminal reason behind a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old girl being pregnant. And we're talking here about rape.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it goes without saying that girls as young as 9 or 10, there's absolutely no doubt that it's a consequence of sexual violence, and particularly of rape. That's also not to distract from the fact that a very significant portion of older girls, adolescents as it were, their pregnancies are very often also the consequence of sexual violence. In that case, there are very important roles, firstly, that law enforcement needs to play. We found that for a very long time, the facilities available in SAP stations for survivors of sexual assault, especially child survivors, are to put it mildly, wanting. The FCS services, the Family Child Violence and Sexual Assault Services, that are supposed to be offered in substations are sometimes non-existent. In many cases, substations are actually sites for re-victimization of survivors. So they might either be turned away, laughed at, belittled, or very shockingly often are actually sexually assaulted again by police officers where they try to reach out to them. So I think the first and most important thing to say from the criminal element is that our justice system needs to be doing a lot more to ensure the police officers are sufficiently trained, but also that they're working with Tutuzela care centers, for example, with the Department of Social Development to ensure that they rebuild trust in communities as a safe mechanism. When it comes to schools, one of the most important things to remember is that whether or not a pregnancy is as a result of criminal causes, one of the worst things that a school can do, and it's also illegal, is to exclude the child or to make them feel like they do not have a right to participate in their education. We know that when a girl experiences an early pregnancy, she is significantly more likely to experience another early pregnancy before she turns the age of 18. And when those girls are forced to either stay at home or to be excluded from school activities, especially in the cases where a huge number of those cases are perpetrated by someone they know, we exponentially increase the likelihood. And that's why during COVID, the number of cases increased by between 40 to 60%.
Very quickly, before I let you go, Daniel, I mean, the role of society, of course, also, you know, is very important, particularly when it comes to making sure that perpetrators who are known, particularly to the community, are brought to book. I mean, what there, you know, in terms of equal education, are you finding in as far as trends are concerned, and how should societies go about doing this?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, and I'm glad I can answer it. So there's a couple things to say. The first one is that as much as we have been speaking about the fact that a significant number of these pregnancies are as a result of criminal activity, we do also know that particularly for sort of older adolescents, there are a variety of reasons why an early pregnancy might occur, and they're not always as a result of sexual violence or rape. And so it's very important that ultimately, whenever we're engaging with someone who is experiencing an early pregnancy, that we operate from a position of support, from centering that person and their needs, and ensuring that we don't operate with stigma. So as a society, I think the first and most important thing we need to do is to introspect about the way that we talk about girls' sexuality and boys' sexuality, whether or not that's a consequence of sexual violence. The way we treat girls and boys is very different very often, and that can lead to girls being put into situations where they're not safe. The second thing is, exactly as you mentioned, we also need to introspect about the extent to which we protect perpetrators, not only as communities, but again, very often perpetrators are protected by either local community policing forums or sort of rogue elements of those forums, obviously, or by police stations themselves. And then I think the third thing that we need to do is to continue to advocate for girls and boys to be able to make decisions about their bodies which are best for them, not to be coerced into positions which are unhealthy or dangerous from them, and to be able to have access to sexual and reproductive health services, no matter the cause or the consequences of an early pregnancy for them.